Hey guys, how's it going, and welcome back for another Total War video with the Terminator. In this video, I want to talk about the so-called divide in the Total War community between the historical and fantasy players. Now, the reason why I bring this up isn't to stir the pot or cause any sort of dispute between the two types of players or communities. In fact, what I want to do today is debunk the myth that a divide in the community exists at all. I've been thinking about this for a while, ever since the Warhammer 3 hype train went full steam ahead and all the Reddit conversations about the various reveals, the historical fans' heightened resentment to the continued investment in the Warhammer trilogy, yada yada, and all of this led me to create a poll over the weekend to see of my subscriber base what actually is the split between people who play historical, fantasy, or both. What started as a curiosity, as you can see, led to a pretty interesting result. It's been less than a day and about 3,000 people have voted in the poll in an almost even split between the historical only option and the both historical and fantasy option. Now, just a quick disclaimer before I continue here, I am by no means a statistician. I've done statistical analysis before, I've done market research before, I've tried to extrapolate insights out of research before, but I wouldn't call myself an expert in any way. You can agree or disagree with anything I have to say here, of course. At the end of the day, these are my thoughts, and I invite you to agree or disagree with me in the comments section below, or point out if I've missed anything. So let's get started. For a long time now, I guess 3 to 4 years, I've personally assumed that there is a bit of a divide in the Total War community between historical and fantasy players, between people who entered the franchise through the Warhammers, through Three Kingdoms or Troy, and people who have been with the franchise since the earlier games from Shogun to Attila. I wasn't, of course, ignorant of the possibility that there would be an overlap, but I guess because personally I felt a little resentment towards CA for not making a historical game in the last 5 to 6 years, I assumed that overlap was quite minor. Now, don't get me wrong, I still think there is some resentment in the historical community, but what this poll shows to me, first and foremost, is that that resentment is much smaller than I thought it was, and the point really is that many historical players enjoy the fantasy games as well. So let's take a closer look at the poll. The question was, what kind of Total War games have you played? And the results show that 51% of my subscribers have played both the historical and fantasy Total War games, while 49% play the historical games only. The first key takeaway here is that there isn't nearly as much of a divide between historical and fantasy players as people think. Most historical players play fantasy Total War games as well. The second piece of insight I take away from the poll is that the historical player base never actually left the Total War franchise. Some players absolutely did leave for other games, especially as we haven't had a historical title in the last 6 years. But the number of those players is eclipsed by players who stuck with the franchise, whether on the historical side only or both. Just to visualize what I mean for a second, let's take a quick Venn diagram. What I've done here is input the present day Steam player count for the accumulated historical Total War games versus the fantasy Total War games. My poll of 3,000 votes shows the preferences of a subset of my subscribers, and if you extrapolate this universe to be a representative sample of historical Total War players overall, we can assume that of the 30,000 players who currently play historical games, 51% of those play fantasy games as well, or 15,000 players that play both. What I'm trying to show here is that there's a far greater number of Total War players interested in historical Total War players than we assumed. Another piece of data we can look at is the Steam player charts over time. So what I've done here with some nifty graphs and some data is track the change of total player counts for both types of Total War games over time from May 2016, which is when the first Warhammer game came out, to November 2019, which is roughly 6 months after Three Kingdoms came out, to present day. What I'm trying to do here is corroborate the results of the poll. The hypothesis is, if in reality historical players aren't really interested in fantasy games and the poll is wrong, then there should be a pretty steep drop-off in historical title player bases over time. But that's not the case. In May 2016, historical titles had a combined 40,000 players. Today, that number is 30,000. and that number hasn't changed since November 2019 at least. The point I'm trying to make here, guys, is there is definitely a number of people who play historical only, who've played the Total War since the earlier days and haven't had any interest at all in playing the fantasy titles. And vice versa, there's a large group of people who started playing Total War with the fantasy titles and have never touched a historical game. But there is a far bigger group of people who have played both, who started with historicals and who currently play the fantasy games, and many of them will still be playing the historicals today as well. There really is no real divide in the types of players. The community isn't actually that split. If the poll shows anything, it's that Creative Assembly have every incentive to make a new historical title because the player base is there, and if anything, it's bigger than ever. By going into a fantasy market, what Creative Assembly essentially did is grow both player bases. There's far more historical Total War players now than there ever was, and just as much as that is true, there is a great number of fantasy players as well that might be interested in a historical title. Total War games have evolved over time, and while some historical players may feel like they've been left behind, they are in the minority because the majority of historical players play both kinds of games and are still interested in what CA has to offer. The last thing I want to say here is that every major company like Creative Assembly does market research, and they do market research quarterly, half yearly, yearly. It happens often. CA has done their research, and I guarantee you that they already know what we're talking about today, that there is still a major audience interested in a purely historical game. The way I see it, guys, Creative Assembly took a big risk when making the first Warhammer game. The risk was whether historical players would buy the game as well, and it paid off because most of them did. The risk now is whether that will happen with the fantasy audience if CA made a purely historical game. And my guess is yes, it will. And so I'd be very surprised if they didn't make a purely historical title after Warhammer 3. And that's it for today, guys. I wanted to make this video here to address the assumption that there is a divide in the Total War community, to present a few bits of data to show that that divide doesn't really exist, and that the historical player base is still absolutely there and potentially bigger than ever. Hopefully, the decision makers at CA know this as well, and in the next few years, we get a new Total War title that is purely historical. I'd love to hear your thoughts, guys, so let me know what you think or any questions you might have in the comment section below, and let's keep it civil. We're all in the same boat here as big fans and players of the Total War franchise, so there's no need to take anything personally here. Let's just have a nice, open, and honest conversation about the topic. I really do hope you enjoyed this video, guys, and if you did, give it a like and drop any thoughts or questions in the comment section below. Subscribe for more Total War content, gameplay, and news, and thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.